Good afternoon, Abbotsford residents. I'm Mr. Pelican. I'm running for the mayor of Abbotsford to bring the RCMP into Abbotsford and open the city's books on insider trading. Today, I want to give you a special podcast. I'm down at Ross Siemens and his dad's gas station, The Hub. Ross Siemens not only ran with Abbotsford First, which was an organization of a partnership. I showed you yesterday a podcast out on Tracy Road of Dave Sadu, that's a city councillor, part of Abbotsford First with Ross. He ran Ross on the mayorship. Marcus Dalvis, who was their campaign manager of Abbotsford First, Quantum Projects. And I showed you Andy Sadu, the Chancellor of the University and owning the South Asian newspaper. In return to help Ross Siemens get loaded for Henry Braun, they used the South Asian newspaper to hold me out of there in my name and other candidates so they could load their team. This was, like Pierre Polly had said, the Mennonite mob, the M&Ms. But Ross Siemens remodeled this gas station, and he took all the contaminatings to Mission and dumped it against the bank, not too far from where the RCMP station is. And he dumped it where fresh water and everything comes into the creek. Rather than dispose of it and take it to Richmond, to the refinery, he couldn't do that. He couldn't do it at all. And Vicky Hopes, who was controlled through the Abbotsford newspaper through Ken and Rick Rakes, and knew not to scandal Ross Siemens because Henry needed him in for the election. But Ross Siemens also did this. Darren Braun was a proving officer in front of his dad, Henry Braun. And Ross Siemens took over to be the deputy chair mayor and allowed Darren Braun to bring projects forward for his dad, which was a conflict of interest to benefit lifts to his dad and bringing government resources to jobs next to his lands, originating themselves. Ross Siemens also was the mayor when Abbotsford homeowners' houses were violated and damaged by these jobs. Ross Siemens was pumped up by an establishment, an elite ring. It was his team, Abbotsford First and Sandy Blue, at the sports center. The most disgusting, filthiest thing I ever seen, said I grabbed Sandy Blue up the dress in order to scandal me and get me charged, which is a very dangerous charge, to load Ross Siemens. It was Barty Sandhu and Rianne Gasper, the BC Conservative MLA for Abbotsford Mission, called it out, and Ross fled running. It didn't call for Ross to flee running. It called for Ross to be a leader, stand up and have the Abbotsford police charged. But this was all to benefit Ross, for Henry to load Ron Funk's decisions and jobs. They were collaborating. This is why Henry's Brown's son, when he opened the mouth and showed him up into his dad's house, collaborating on Cooper's farm. Ross also benefited by putting his signs on Ron Funk, a diverse, on a developer, to run him through the mayor election in his team. And now he owned Ron Funk, and this is why they could change his zoning from 200 to 400. This is why he could cut down the trees. This is why his permits were rushed. This is why Magna didn't enforce bylaw, or nothing was infraction down there. This was taking place on a massive scale. But because of Henry's connections through Mike DeYoung and Ed Fast in controlling the whole of the Abbotsford police, they could use the police, who, if you went anywhere to complain to your MLA, tip off to Henry Braun, and Henry would use the police to threaten. Ross Siemens knew when the Abbotsford police were blocking and checking and everything that he was benefiting from this insider trading. But Ross Siemens did this. I've ran podcasts and I showed you of how many days he's working at this gas station when he's supposed to be doing his mayor duties, and he won't. He comes down here and he hides. When you run for mayor, prime minister, or premier, you must step away from your company and not allow your company to benefit. Ross was here during business hours while Nancy Friesen was telling residents that were phoning in that no, he's on a mayor business right now on a campaign, but he was here in his gas station doing his paperwork and his GST, not just one time. You know how many times I video filmed that and showed that out. That is the wisdom and knowledge of the RCMP, saying he was double dipping. And they said, so it took Bruce Bamman all his mayor term to work the mayor, and it took Henry Brown twice as long, but this guy didn't. He was benefiting and making sure his company was benefiting off of it too. And you saw the elite establishment, because Ross was never running the city. Henry was, and the bureaucrats from the back to prop him up. Then you saw Ross with his councils, his team, his slate, his partnership, his partners. Haul all the rocks down on Gladys on the homeless to move the homeless to benefit Ron Funk. You saw Ross on the Mackenzie bog where people got deadly sick. Not fire Magna or bring her under investigations, or call the Environment of Canada to shut it down because it was friends that were tied to the elite establishment, that family. And when people got deadly sick, you saw Ross not order the Abbotsford police that enforce bylaw and bylaw officers, either with Jake's towing, to go down to Manny Farms and pull 500 cars that are on ag land that you're not allowed to be doing it. But Magna and Abbotsford City wrote articles that they were going to go after the South Asian dump trucks on farmlands, and it was printed everywhere on the front of the newspaper. But then you saw Ross reward Dave Sadhu's dad on Tracy Road through Vitalis. They also went in and used the city to lobby the money from the feds and the provincial to their friends, enriching themselves. It doesn't call for Ross Siemens to step out and get away with this. It calls for charges, a massive charges for organized crime. Ross Siemens was counsel when Henry got in his car and left the city and tried to kill me, fled from the scene of the accident. Mike Sir covered it up, and Abbotsford police officers started threatening. Ross Siemens knew as counsel when Olenoff said drop the videos and the lawsuit. The videos of Henry having counsel in his house, and the lawsuit with Abbotsford homeowners, or he will personally bury me. Ross Siemens knew as mayor when Abbotsford police smashed my camera and my phone my son bought me for Father's Day and said that I was in Abbotsford, and they had enough witnesses to frame me and charge me to get me out of the way because Henry was ordering them when I was in White Rock, and I gave Colin Watts an open invitation. This is not political politics. This is an elite ring that was enriching themselves and not doing their jobs to be a servant for the people. I waited 4 years where they ran roughshod on me, tried to run me out of town, tried to frame me, and tried to do that. Thanks to the RCMP, and I showed you Dallas Brody's and all these politicians, this time is here. I am going to take chunks out of Ross Siemens and his team like no one before. And I'm adamant of bringing the RCMP into Abbotsford and putting criminals where criminals need to go, into prison. Not a pass, not looking away, but criminals need to go into prison. This man violated Abbotsford's taxpayers. This man rushed decisions with his team. This man took advantage of what he knew Dave Sadhu was doing illegally and didn't want to play in a democracy and a democratic process. Now you're going to see Ross Siemens try. Henry's got to convince Ross, you need to run again, Ross. We have too much at stake. All the development sites are Ron Funk's, all the job sites, all the infrastructure money Brad Viss is lobbying, trying to get that flood money, all the stuff coming in from David Eby, worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Hundreds of millions of dollars. But at the same time, making sure that their money that they were after went as far as putting people in the grave. These men are Henry, Ross, and Brad Viss, are church-going, Bible-thumping little weasels. And somewhere in their commandments, it says, "Thou shalt not steal." That means they weren't honoring that. They were using that to fool Abbotsford residents and to fool the law. Then they pulled people beside them that they could fool people with, like Mark Workentine. Mark Workentine's a lawyer. and he owns a law practice. Why would he ever risk that? Kelly Shahal, a probation officer, why would she ever risk it? When you have a massive amount of money that could set you up the rest of your life, everybody's going to risk it. This is why people bust into Fort St. Knox and steal art gallery pictures, everything. This is why you see on local media police chiefs and law enforcement officers of 20 years caught in gangs and organizations. But the general public should never be blocked from coming forward or being threatened, because when you do that, this allows that organized criminal ring to control it, and it doesn't allow the law to see. This is what needed to be stopped. This ring was well put together, and the trained Kaitoon himself, Henry Brown, was in charge of this. And he was running this. This man deserves where every criminal goes for what he done. And this man then worked here, and like his aunt said, she's going to talk to him. This nonsense got to stop. He didn't step away from his business to run the city because he knew Dave Lowens and Nancy Friesen and the lackeys would run the city, and he was just a face for it. And this is what brought him into trouble. But he decided to do this and allow this to happen. He stood by when Abbotsford First did this. He stood by when the Ron Funks did this. He stood by on Cooper's Farm. He stood by. He didn't have any morals, ethics, or principles. Then he stood by knowing that what was on social media podcast out of the Abbotsford Police pulling me out of the truck and lying and everything. And he's the board of the Abbotsford Police. Instead of going down there and smashing Colin Watts and his top investigators and demanding that they're completely removed, it's unacceptable. He didn't do that. Because he was told to sit down, shut up, and listen. The establishment stands to lose hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars and go to jail. This is why, thanks to many people that worked hard, after the attack on my life and other people's lives and the EDA witnessing and everything, and I made a podcast showing you that, you know, as bad as it was, and you saw me on social media, and I look at it now, that sometimes this has to happen to you in order for good people to rise, to go after guys like Ross Siemens, in order for good people to rise. And Ross Siemens knows what Corky Neufeld did to lift Amric Moran with Archway Community Services, San Diego. Ross knows Patricia Driesing, owning Perfect Senses, insider trading, and she's the director of Archway. This man was trying to run his business. It ain't. This is his dad that made this successful business. And when I sat with his dad, he told me his son was in trouble when he was 30, so I knew Henry could own him very easy. And his dad was trying to come to understanding and said, these ain't man. These ain't man when you attack families. These ain't man when you try to steal. These ain't man when you're not looking after your community. These are people that will go to any length to fill their pockets. Abbotsford residents, I'm asking for your mayor term when I come along, but I'm also asking to get the RCMP into Abbotsford, what will solve it faster. But we're going to go after this guy, and I'm going to chew chunks out of him. No Greg Toes is going to block me and bribe me. No Gabriel's going to hold me out, that I can tell you, and steal my signs. That's never going to happen. No Dave Sadu with his South Asian newspaper is ever going to cover up from the South Asians to see, especially when they see his lift on his land and Andy Sadu's. That's 100% guaranteed. No Abbotsford First is going to make false accusations and control the narrative at the sports center and go to the speaker and the host and try to get it blocked. This ain't going to happen. And no Abbotsford Police, Colin Watts, his lead investigators, and his undercover officers are going to ring my house, try to block me and terrorize me through the town, because they have wrecked their lives. And they know that they got to be let go. And they're trying to sell a community that they live in this community, work in this community, got family in this community. They're very important. They're only very important to an elite mob. They weren't very important to this community. And when they realized they were against the wall and they could accomplish what they were going to try to accomplish in this organized crime ring, it got exposed thanks to Darren Brown, and we went to the Mission RCMP. Without the Mission RCMP, nothing would have been on podcast, and you would have never had any of this evidence. It would have looked like a conspiracy. You would have never known that Ed Fast was working with Henry Brown. You would have never known the stuff Mike DeYoung did to endorse Dave Sadu. You would have never known what Marcus Dalvis did with Abbotsford First. You would have never known the decisions behind the back. You would have thought the city's doing great and the city's moving forward, but not for its residents. For an elite ring to benefit off of. What took place up at the golf course on Ledgeview with the Abbotsford police guy stating that he was a police officer in the Ford truck, telling me to pull over so he could put a gun to my head and end me. I believe that the mob had sent him out to do this. And Colin Watts hasn't come forward to find that officer. He hasn't advised the Abbotsford community that there's a man going around in a brand new Ford posing as an officer. He knew my name. I told the whole things. He's sitting there taking pictures with Brad Viss, and Brad will pump him up. Brad's in everybody's riding. He's in Suk Mangel's riding. He's in Mark Strahl's riding, arguing for this flood money. He needs to go back into his riding, shut his mouth, and work for Mission. For example, Brad moved his office to 33058 First Avenue in Mission because he didn't like the homeless gathering around his old office. Rather than argue to do better for his riding, he didn't. So he packed up and he fled because they were in Burdenham. This is a man that's always over in Suk Mangel's riding and over here in Abbotsford, because the emphasis from Brad Viss is to get that flood money. In my opinion, Brad, how much are you going to be paid from Ed and Henry to get that money? What's your reward? That is why you work so hard on it constantly. That is why you stick your nose in somebody else's riding. Not just Sukman's, but also Mark Straw's, and you don't pay attention to yours. And this is why you're trying to be the big top dog of leaving that money. In my opinion, they said you go get that money and we're going to reward you, Brad, because you're tossing your career down the tubes, because you're supposed to be an MLA and you're supposed to go back to Ottawa with garbage like this. I'm live, Abbotsford, British Columbia, the hub gas station, Ross Siemens.